My earliest memories are steeped in the smell of freshly baked bread from my mother's kitchen and the clanging of tools in my father's workshop. Growing up in a small New York town, life was simple but full of purpose. The routines of daily life, coupled with a strong sense of community, taught me the value of hard work and persistence. My parents were the anchors of my world, providing stability and warmth even when the winters were harsh and resources were scarce. I remember dreaming of the day I would carve out my own path, blending the lessons they taught me with aspirations of a brighter, independent future. As I grew older, the desire to explore life beyond the confines of my childhood home only intensified. After high school, I ventured into the unknown, armed with ambition and an unshakable belief in a better tomorrow. Through struggles and triumphs, I built a life defined by resilience and a relentless pursuit of happiness. Yet, as the years unfolded, life's unpredictability often brought me back to the grounding lessons of my youth, lessons that would shape the decisions I faced later in life. Both of my children were grown-ups now. That was one of the reasons I decided to sell the farmhouse located outside Rochester. The other motivation was that I had grown tired of enduring the harsh winters. This part of the country could be productive, sure, but I no longer had any compelling reason to remain. I wanted to spend the rest of my life basking in sunny warmth, ideally alongside a wonderful woman. Now that's what I call a dream. My son worked as a teacher in North Carolina, while my daughter had recently gotten married and was expecting a baby after Christmas, which would make me a grandfather. Last year, she and her husband relocated to California. Maybe the warmer climate had something to do with her newfound family plans. Having sold the farm, I was sorting through the belongings that defined my years here. The movers would ensure everything reached California safely. My task was simply to label what was coming with me and pack the sentimental items. Most of the furniture stayed behind for the young couple who bought the place. It was their first real home. I only kept the books from my library and the original art that adorned the walls. The property spanned roughly 20 acres, complete with a spacious old house, 2 barns, a detached garage with room for 4 cars, and extensive fencing for the horses. Well, maybe not quite endless, but when you're the one painting it, it sure feels that way. This place carried a lifetime of memories. It was the first home I purchased for my kids after my wife left me for her lover, seeking escape from what she deemed a monotonous life with me. I raised my twins, Kelly and Brian Jr., here. Watching them grow into adults was a journey full of scrapes, arguments, and countless cherished moments. That was more than 2 decades ago now. Let me take a step back and explain things from the beginning. My name is Brian Carter. I was born in southern New York State, in a small town where nobody bothered locking their doors and Sundays were reserved for church services. You know the kind of town, where the highlight of the week might be watching the grass grow. My mother, who had a college education, passed on her knowledge to me, while my father ran a store. He worked tirelessly to ensure we had everything we needed for a comfortable life. When I was big enough to hold my own, my mother convinced my father that I should start music lessons. Now, neither of them played an instrument, so they didn't know much about the various options. They skipped over woodwinds and strings and instead wandered into a piano shop. As a kid, my first thought was, how am I supposed to manage one of those things in the Memorial Day parade? It worried me a lot. Keep in mind, I was just 11 years old, and the modern era of keyboards was still years away. The salesman at the store, however, was a pro. We had gone in intending to buy a small piano, but ended up purchasing an organ instead. Of course, we didn't leave with it that day. It was scheduled for delivery in 2 weeks. The organ wasn't brand new. It had been owned by a family whose circumstances changed when the husband was transferred out of state, and they decided against paying the steep cost of shipping it. That's likely why we got it. It was inexpensive. The store had already profited from its original sale and didn't need to charge much the second time around. I started taking lessons once a week and practiced an hour daily all through high school. At first, my mom wanted me to practice right after school, but that cut into my time with friends. My dad came up with a solution. If you practice right after dinner, I'll take over your dish-drying chore, he offered. You can stop practicing as soon as the dishes are done. At the time, I thought it was a great deal since I despised drying dishes. Normally, it took about 15 minutes, but somehow my dad stretched it to an hour. It was years before I caught on. By then, though, I genuinely enjoyed playing, and practicing no longer felt like a burden. In my teenage years, my taste in music shifted toward the rock and roll of my generation. The challenge was that most bands back then didn't use organs. They relied on guitars and drums. So I had to figure out how to replicate those sounds with the organ, using both hands and feet. Over time, I got pretty skilled at mimicking the sounds of popular bands. During my senior year of high school, my guidance counselor encouraged me to consider music school instead of a traditional college. To my surprise, I was invited to audition at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. With my organ teacher's help, I prepared classical pieces and refined my technique in the weeks leading up to the audition. When the day arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't eat or sleep, and my hands shook as I waited in the hallway outside the practice room. Other applicants sat silently around me, all lost in their own anxieties. When my name was called, I stepped into the audition room and was greeted by three kind-looking women and a piano. But I didn't play piano. Unlike an organ, a piano required a completely different touch, and I had never developed that skill. Staring at the unfamiliar instrument, I froze. One of the women noticed and asked gently, "Is there a problem, Mr. Carter?" I managed to nod. "Yes, ma'am, I don't play piano. I'm an organist." She pressed further. "You've never learned on a piano?" "No, ma'am," I admitted. "I've only ever played organ. If I'd known a piano was required, I wouldn't have come." The women exchanged whispers before one left the room. A few minutes later, she returned, smiling. "Mr. Carter, please gather your things and follow us. We've located an available organ." Relieved but still nervous, I followed them through the building. The halls were magnificent, marble floors, walls, and ceilings, with brass light fixtures and ornate oak doors. It was a far cry from the utilitarian corridors of modern schools. As we walked, the sound of music grew louder. We eventually arrived at a set of oversized double doors. One of the women opened them and the music swelled around us. Inside was an auditorium, with red velvet seats and a dazzling chandelier suspended from an intricately decorated ceiling. I later learned that George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, had donated the theater to the school in the early 1900s. "The Philharmonic is wrapping up their practice session," one of the women informed me. Another added, "Actually, that's the jazz ensemble. They play more contemporary music." The conductor brought the musicians to a dramatic finish and gave them a few parting instructions. As he prepared to leave, he noticed our group approaching. Turning back to his ensemble, he announced, "There's an audition happening on the organ for a prospective student. Let's make sure we exit quietly. It's a stressful experience." The room fell silent as I glanced around. All eyes were on me. Some of the musicians smiled, others nodded, and I could feel their acknowledgement. These were professionals, legends in their own right, and they were recognizing me, a 17-year-old kid from the middle of nowhere. But there wasn't much time to soak it all in. One of the women ushered me into the orchestra pit and began setting up the enormous concert organ. As I settled onto the bench, she walked me through the intricate layout of the massive console. I had never encountered anything like it before, and my chest tightened as panic set in. Failure felt inevitable. "It's a pipe organ," she explained. "There's a slight delay between pressing the keys and hearing the sound. I hope that won't be an issue for you. Let's start with some scales to warm up." Nodding, I played through the scales a few times. The lag wasn't as bad as I feared, and I quickly adapted. Soon after, another woman approached, handing me sheet music with a simple command, "Play." So I played. For 2 hours straight, I performed piece after piece while they evaluated me. When it was finally over, I climbed out of the pit, feeling drained but oddly satisfied. The women thanked me and said, "You'll receive your results in the mail within 2 months." As they left, I stood there, unsure of what to do next. Just as I turned to go, a single pair of hands began clapping. The applause quickly spread, and I realized the jazz ensemble had stayed to listen. They were cheering for me. A few even shouted words of encouragement. My heart swelled with pride as their applause wrapped around me like a warm embrace. For a brief moment, I felt seen, not as a kid trying to make it, but as an equal. The conductor, who had been seated in the back of the theater, approached me. "When you graduate, come find me," he said with a knowing smile. "I think I'll have a spot for you in one of my ensembles." 3 agonizing weeks later, I came home from school to my mom standing in the kitchen, a smile lighting up her face. "The Eastman School called," she said. "You've been accepted. Full 4-year scholarship. You start in the fall." And just like that, the next 4 years of my life were set. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was October, and the weather was every bit as miserable as you'd expect. Cold, wet, and unrelenting. Soon, though, I wouldn't have to endure it. I was moving to California, a place where such dreary weather was practically outlawed. I stepped into the kitchen to make coffee. only to remember that all my appliances had already been packed for the move. Opening the fridge, I hoped to find a beer or soda, but it was spotless and empty. Damn, these movers were efficient. With nothing to drink, I briefly considered ordering a cup of coffee from the local diner, then laughed at myself for the ridiculous thought. Resigned, I decided to brave the cold and walk into the village for a warm drink. But another fierce gust of wind howled against the house, making me rethink that plan. Coffee wasn't worth braving the storm. Instead, I wandered into the living room and began taking down the paintings I wanted to bring with me. Over the years, I had developed a passion for the art of the Wyeth family. It started with N.C. Wyeth's illustrations, especially those from classic children's books. I collected first editions featuring his work, along with high-quality reproductions of his paintings. Later, I branched out to the art of his son, Andrew Wyeth, who captured the essence of rural Pennsylvania in his vivid landscapes. My collection even extended to Jamie Wyeth, Andrew's son. My favorite piece of his was Pig, a breathtakingly detailed portrait of a pig that I had seen in a museum outside Wilmington, Delaware. I bought a smaller reproduction that day, and it became one of my prized possessions. Though I owned no originals, the cost of acquiring, insuring, and securing them was too high. I took pride in my collection of museum-grade reproductions. They were beautiful, fit seamlessly into my home, and spared me the headache of having to explain why an empty frame hung on my wall with a loan to the Met tag. Opposite the artwork hung my music industry awards. No, I hadn't become a household name or churned out platinum albums. My voice was decent, my looks unremarkable. And let's face it, organ music wasn't exactly the sound that topped the charts. Instead, I found success behind the scenes. My music education taught me how to compose both lyrics and melodies, and I had a knack for imitating the styles of other artists. I could write songs that sounded like they belonged to Frank Sinatra or another legend, blending nostalgia with originality. But this wasn't an overnight success. In the early years, I worked in a dull office, shuffling papers and inching my way up the corporate ladder to support my family. My big break in music came much later. As I thought back on those days, memories of my early struggles bubbled to the surface. After graduating from Eastman, I didn't land a dream job in music or become the next big thing. In reality, I didn't even have a lead. My degree, impressive as it was, didn't open doors the way I'd hoped. I ended up as a lowly clerk at a manufacturing company, surrounded by rows of identical desks. It seemed like I was destined to spend decades pushing paper. In my single days, I spent my nights doing the typical bachelor things, frequenting bars, catching football games, and attending car races. Bar hopping, in particular, was my go-to activity. The challenge, though, was deciding between hitting up lively venues with live bands, packed with guys vying for the same women, and the quieter neighborhood pubs where I could just hang out with my buddies. Of course, the bars with bands came with a steep price, cover charges and inflated drink prices, but they were also my best chance to meet women. As much as I hated the expense, the alternative was spending another night nursing beers with my friends, which didn't exactly help my dating life. Being an underpaid office clerk with both rent and car payments, I had to be strategic about my nights out. Most evenings, I stuck to cheap pitchers of beer with the guys, saving the club outings for Fridays or Saturdays. On those nights, I'd sip a couple of drinks over the course of the evening, trying to look cool. It was during one of these weekend outings that I met Mary. Mary was about 5'6", with a figure that could stop traffic. She was cute, friendly, and carried herself with a confidence that made her even more attractive. We danced the night away and spent the evening talking and laughing, getting to know each other. It took a couple more weekends of running into her at the club before I managed to get her out to my car. We kissed and fooled around a bit in the back seat, but she always stopped things before they went too far, insisting we head back inside. She had no trouble re-entering the club. Being a woman, the bouncers waved her through. But I, broke as I was, couldn't afford the re-entry fee. That pretty much summed up our dynamic. Mary always had the upper hand. A month later, I saw her again, sitting with a group of friends. She smiled at me as I approached, and we shared a couple of dances. But halfway through the second song, another guy walked up, wrapped his arms around her, and kissed her like they were in a movie. I froze, ready to intervene, until I saw Mary enthusiastically returning the embrace. Feeling like a third wheel, I slipped back to the bar, only to find my drink, jacket, and seat had all been claimed by someone else. By the time I spotted Mary again, she was heading out the door with her new guy. I walked home that night, shivering without my jacket, and growing increasingly bitter toward her with every step. Over the next few months, I kept running into Mary at various clubs. We'd exchange polite nods, but I never asked her to dance or tried to restart anything. Instead, I focused on meeting other women. At 6 feet tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, I wasn't exactly bad looking. I'd even been told I was easy on the eyes. Still, I wasn't bold, and my reserved nature often left me overlooked. "You're just too shy," women would say. Maybe they were right, but it was how I was raised, not to push or pressure anyone. One night, while I was taking a break at the bar, I heard a familiar voice. "Hi, Brian. Don't you want to dance with me anymore?" It was Mary, standing behind me with a playful smile. "I'm just taking a breather," I replied coolly. "Work tomorrow, you know." "But Brian, I want to dance." "Mary," I said, my tone sharpening, "this place is packed. I'm sure someone will be happy to dance with you and walk you out to the parking lot." Before she could respond, I stood up and headed for the door. She tried to follow, but a couple of guys intercepted her, eager for her attention. The last thing I saw before leaving was her flirting with them as though I'd never been there. Rochester wasn't a huge city, so there weren't many clubs with dance floors, which meant I kept bumping into Mary. For months, we continued our awkward avoidance routine. Sometimes, though, I swore I caught her watching me. Still, I stayed distant, figuring it was for the best. That all changed one night as I was walking to my truck after leaving a club. The sound of a woman crying out caught my attention. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear during a good time. It was sharp, desperate. Grabbing a nearby push broom, I broke the handle, fashioning a makeshift club, and headed toward the sound. My heart raced as I approached, listening for any sign of what was happening. I heard fabric tearing, a man cursing in pain, and the unmistakable sound of a fist hitting. Picking up speed, I rounded the corner of a parked car and froze. Two men were pinning a woman to the ground. One held her down while the other struggled to pull off her jeans. Her terrified eyes met mine, and I realized with a sickening jolt, it was Mary. Without hesitation, I charged toward them, gripping my makeshift weapon tightly, ready to fight for her safety. The instinct to act took over before I even thought it through. I swung the broom handle, striking the man, pinning her down, connecting hard. He stumbled back, collapsing. The second man, who had been trying to forcefully restrain her, froze before scrambling to his feet. I acted again with my makeshift club, striking him on the side. He staggered but tried to get up, so I struck again. I didn't stop until someone intervened and pulled me back. In hindsight, it's a good thing they did. I might have gone too far. The bouncers restrained me until the police arrived. Once everything was under control, the two individuals were taken to the hospital and later charged with attempted misconduct. A detective interviewed me about what had happened. He sternly reminded me of the risks of intervening in such situations, how I could have been seriously hurt, and how I should have let law enforcement handle it. But after delivering his lecture, he leaned in and whispered, "Good job, son." Later, I learned that these men had been involved in a string of attacks in the area. That night, I also found out the details of what Mary had been through. She had arrived at the club with a friend who left her behind, and she'd accepted a ride home from one of the attackers. Instead of taking her home, they drove to the back of the parking lot, where their intentions became clear. Mary fought hard, scratching one guy's face and struggling to get free, but the other grabbed her. If I hadn't come along, she might not have survived. A policewoman wrapped Mary in a blanket and brought her over to me. She was trembling, her jeans torn, and clutching at what was left of her bra for modesty. When she saw me, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She clung to me like her life depended on it, and I had no choice but to scoop her up and carry her to my truck. The officer followed, carrying Mary's purse and helping me get her settled in the passenger seat while keeping her decency intact. I didn't know where Mary lived, so I brought her to my apartment. My plan was simple. Let her rest in my bed while I slept on the couch, then figure things out in the morning. But that plan went out the window quickly. For the next few nights, the only way Mary could sleep was in my arms. She woke up screaming whenever I tried to leave her alone, so I stayed. Holding her, comforting her. It wasn't exactly a hardship, but I did my best to be respectful. Mary never returned to her apartment. 6 months later, when her lease ended, she let it go without a second thought. She'd been living with me since the night of the attack. And by then, it was clear that neither of us wanted her to leave. Years later, I was back at my old farmhouse, tying up loose ends. The house had been emptied out. All the furniture, linens, and other belongings had either been packed for my new place or donated. When I heard a knock at the back door, I thought it might be the cab I'd called to take me back to the city. Opening the door, I got the shock of my life. It was Mary, but not the Mary I remembered. She looked frail, her frame so slight she couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds soaking wet. Her clothes hung on her like rags, and her face was a patchwork of scars. Her nose had been broken and flattened, and a jagged scar ran from her temple across her face, ending near her mouth. Most shocking of all was the eye patch she wore. It wasn't just for show. I knew instinctively there was nothing underneath it. My mind snapped back to the day she left. A memory burned into my mind. I had been at work when my supervisor handed me a note. "Your neighbor called," he said. "Your kids are at her house. Your wife isn't home." Confused and worried, I called the neighbor, who explained that my 6-year-old twins were safe at her place. But something was very wrong. "Mary moved out," she said. "Around 10 this morning, a van showed up and she and 2 men loaded it with her things. They left the house wide open. I went over after they left to lock up, but the place was a disaster. Drawers overturned, clothes everywhere. Another neighbor and I spent the afternoon cleaning up so the kids wouldn't be scared." I'd driven home in a daze, unsure what to expect. When I arrived, Sue Sharp, my neighbor, met me at the car. "Brian," she said gently, "I'm so sorry." Mary didn't just leave. She made a scene. Those guys she was with, they were all over each other, laughing and groping. It was disgusting. I thanked her numbly, words failing me. Now, standing face to face with Mary all these years later, I felt the weight of those memories pressing down, mingled with the shock of her appearance. What had happened to her in the time since she walked out of our lives? The days following Mary's departure were a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours meeting with lawyers, closing bank accounts, freezing credit cards, and taking care of everything necessary to protect myself and the kids. The hardest part, though, was explaining to Kelly and Brian Jr. where their mom had gone. I didn't know, so I told them a half-truth. It was painful to lie, but I couldn't bear to let them feel the hurt I was carrying. Kelly burst into tears, worried her mom was hurt or lost, while Brian Jr. held her close, his face calm and stoic. It was a bond only twins could understand. The divorce took nearly a year to finalize. Since Mary couldn't be located, my lawyer filed on grounds of desertion. There were no arguments about child support, alimony, or visitation rights. As far as the court was concerned, she no longer existed in our lives. Technically, it takes 7 years to declare someone legally dead, but for me and the kids, that chapter was closed. After putting the kids to bed each night, I found solace in my music. Sitting at my organ, I began composing and writing lyrics, tailoring each song to the styles of various artists I admired. Over time, I became skilled at mimicking their sounds. Occasionally, I'd play for neighbors who would swear they recognized the song as something by the Beatles or another famous band, but couldn't quite place it. Their reactions made me smile, knowing I had created the music from scratch. It became a passion, filling the quiet evenings with purpose. One day, I ran into Jake, a classmate from my Eastman days. He'd had some moderate success with a few hit albums, but was struggling creatively when we reconnected. As we caught up, the conversation kept circling back to his slump. He was frustrated and desperate for inspiration. Wanting to help, I invited him to my house under the pretense of visiting the kids. After we played some music together, I had a sense of his style and decided to share one of my songs with him. We played it a few times, refining it until he felt comfortable. The next morning, I found Jake in my driveway at the crack of dawn, excited as a kid on Christmas morning. He'd stayed up all night tweaking the lyrics and was eager to share the revised version. Over coffee and breakfast, he performed it for me and the kids, who were thrilled to see a song come to life before their eyes. Jake and I spent the entire weekend working on more songs. By Sunday evening, he left my house with 10 new tracks, already coordinating practice sessions with his band as he walked to his car. A month later, Kelly burst into the house shouting for me to turn on the radio. One of the songs Jake and I had worked on was playing, climbing the charts fast. Hearing my music on the radio was surreal, even if no one but Jake, the kids, and I knew I'd written it. For a moment, I felt a quiet pride. A few days later, Jake called with more good news. "The label wants to do an entire album around this new sound," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Jake, that's incredible," I replied. "I'm so happy to see your career taking off again." "Brian, it's your music," he insisted. "I set you up with an agent. You're going to get every cent of the royalties you deserve." At first, I protested. "Jake, those songs were my gift to you. I don't want to profit from your success." "Stop being a martyr," he shot back. "This is my way of saying thank you." Within a few months, royalty checks started arriving. Initially, they were substantial, like having a well-paying second job. Over time, as Jake and his band found their stride, the checks became smaller, eventually tapering off. Still, The experience had been rewarding. Jake had his mojo back, and I felt fulfilled knowing I'd helped. 2 years later, the phone rang one evening. This time, I answered it myself, expecting another teenage boy calling for Kelly. Instead, it was Jake. "Hey, Brian, how's the new place? You getting settled in?" "A little," I admitted. "Still setting up." "Good, because I have someone who could use your help." "What kind of help?" I asked cautiously. "She's looking to make a comeback, but needs music in her old style. She's been struggling, and I told her you're the guy who can deliver." "Who are we talking about?" I asked, intrigued. When Jake said her name, I nearly dropped the phone. She was a multi-platinum artist, a household name. I felt a wave of both awe and doubt. "I don't know, Jake. She's a legend. I'm just a guy who writes songs in his living room. She's willing to move into your house for a couple of weeks so you can work together," he added, laughing. "But I warned her, you're all business." "Jake, my kids are home. There's no room for anything but songwriting." A week later, Kelly handed me a message from Jake. "Be at the airport at 7 a.m. on Saturday to meet your house guest," it read. When Kelly asked who was coming, I simply said, "A friend. We're going to make music." Saturday morning found the three of us, me, Kelly, and Brian Jr., standing near the airport's arrivals area, scanning the crowd for Jake's friend. Kelly and Brian were craning their necks, clearly expecting someone glamorous or flashy, while I kept my own expectations grounded. Suddenly, a woman with an unassuming demeanor approached me. She looked like an everyday suburban mom. Baggy clothes, oversized sunglasses. But when she spoke, I recognized her instantly. "Are you Brian Carter?" she asked, her voice as smooth and unmistakable as ever. I nodded, fighting back the surprise. "That's me," I said, turning to the kids. "Okay, team, she's here. Let's go." The woman smiled warmly and said, "Please, call me Beth." Kelly froze for a moment, her eyes widening as the voice she was hearing clashed with the plain appearance in front of her. Before she could blurt out the truth, I managed to cover her mouth with my hand. "Beth, these are my kids, Kelly and Brian Jr. Welcome to town. Let's grab your luggage and find some breakfast." Brian Jr., eager as ever to get behind the wheel, volunteered to retrieve the car from the parking garage. Any excuse to drive would do for him. Once, he'd even suggested driving next door to borrow milk, claiming it would get home faster and stay fresher. I made him walk, of course. Parenting a teenage driver is like a crash course in patience, and in my case, prematurely graying hair. While we waited for him to pull up, Kelly and Beth struck up an animated conversation, whispering and laughing like old friends. Watching them, I felt a pang of bitterness toward Mary, their mother, who had walked away from her children. I could understand someone leaving a spouse, but abandoning her kids, that was something I'd never be able to comprehend. My thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable screech of tires against the curb. Brian Jr. had arrived, albeit with a bit of flair. I sighed. At least tires were cheaper to replace than fenders or bones. We loaded Beth's luggage into the car and headed home. That evening, once the kids were settled, Beth and I sat them down to explain her presence. I laid down the rules firmly. "To your friends, she's just my cousin Beth from California. No exceptions. If anyone finds out who she really is, you'll both be grounded for life. And I mean it." The seriousness of my tone must have gotten through. The kids nodded solemnly before heading off to bed. As soon as they were out of earshot, Beth turned to me. "Don't you think that was a little harsh?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Kids talk without thinking. The last thing we need is for your visit to make headlines." She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, but you've done an incredible job with them, Brian. I've seen that in just one day." "Thanks," I said. "It hasn't been easy, but I wasn't about to walk out on them like their mother did." Changing the subject, we dove into the music. Hours passed as we worked in my studio, experimenting with melodies and lyrics. By the time the sun began to rise, we finally called it a night. The next morning, the kids let their teenage tendencies shine. Sleeping in well past 10 a.m., I stumbled downstairs, still half asleep, intending to quiet them down. Beth needed rest after our late-night session, and with her internal clock still on West Coast time, she could use all the extra sleep she could get. I promised the kids I'd cook their favorite breakfast after a quick shower, hoping a little bribery would keep them from making too much noise. When I came back downstairs, showered and dressed, I was greeted by the most delicious smells wafting from the kitchen. To my surprise, there was Beth, standing at the stove, flipping pancakes like she owned the place. But that wasn't the shocker. Kelly, my daughter who had never shown the slightest interest in cooking, was standing beside her, helping. "Hi, Dad," Kelly chirped. Beth's teaching me how to cook breakfast. Look, I made the pancake batter from scratch. Want some eggs and bacon too? I blinked, half expecting the scene to dissolve into a dream. This was the same girl who fought tooth and nail against loading the dishwasher, now offering to make me pancakes. I rubbed my temple and muttered, I think I need coffee. Beth lingered in the background, her smile radiant. I was nearly overcome with emotion, my pride for my daughter's achievements swelling to the point of tears. Her voice rang with joy, and I couldn't have been prouder. I'll have a little of everything, I replied with a grin. The breakfast was delightful, extra crunchy pancakes and all. I ate every bite with a smile, relishing the moment. Teen boys, of course, will devour anything in sight, but Kelly's pride was unmistakable. Afterward, Beth and I tackled the kitchen disaster while Kelly basked in the glory of her culinary triumph. I had almost forgotten how messy a new cook could be. It took us an extra 30 minutes to restore the kitchen to a semi-clean state. Later that afternoon, Beth and I were taking a break from working on our music. She turned to me and said, Kelly really needs a female role model right now. I'd like to step into that role if you'll let me. Her words caught me off guard. Wow, I hadn't even considered that, I admitted. I'd love for you to be her mentor, but there's a catch. You're only here for a couple of weeks. We have to think about how Kelly will feel when you leave. Beth cut me off before I could continue. Brian, I've thought it through. First, there's the phone. We can talk every day. Second, we're making incredible music together. After I head home, I'll need studio time to finalize everything. Then I'll be back to work with you. You might not realize it, but you've got a gift, and I'll need more of your songs, and... I tried to chime in, but she held up a hand to stop me. Quiet, let me finish, she said, smiling. When summer vacation rolls around, I'd like Kelly to spend some time with me on the West Coast. She could use a woman's perspective. I promised to take good care of her and bring her back safe and sound. Just then, Kelly walked into the room. Why'd you guys stop working? I want to hear what you've written. By the way, Beth, my dad is the best songwriter ever. Tears welled in my eyes, and Beth reached over, squeezing my hand gently. So, do we have a deal? She asked softly. All I could do was nod in agreement. Beth smiled. Kelly, why don't you put on the kettle for your dad and me? She suggested. Our songwriting spanned nearly 2 months, slowed by my day job. By the end, we'd composed enough material for almost 2 albums. During this time, Kelly and Beth were inseparable. As Beth's departure approached, Kelly grew quieter. One night, they disappeared into Kelly's room for an hour. When Kelly emerged, she flung herself into my lap, hugging me tightly. Daddy, you're the best dad ever, she said, tears streaming down her face. I looked up to see Beth standing in the doorway. I told her about our summer plans, Beth explained. Looks like she's on board. When Beth returned to California, her daily phone calls with Kelly became a ritual. Eventually, I had to get Kelly her own phone to keep the home line free. Beth's album skyrocketed to the top of the charts, her incredible voice belting out our songs wherever you went. 3 months later, I was at the airport waiting for her plane to arrive. She stepped off in a clever disguise, a brown wig with streaks of gray and enough padding to make her appear much heavier. This time, her stay stretched to 4 months, including a wonderful family Christmas. 2 nights after Christmas, I felt someone slipping into my bed. That familiar voice whispered, "Here's the rest of your Christmas gift," as she wrapped herself around me. We didn't sleep for hours, and when morning came, we stayed in bed, relishing each other's company, until a knock on the door interrupted us. Breakfast is in 30 minutes, Kelly called. Get moving, Beth laughed. Caught, she whispered. We both burst into laughter as we headed to the shower. If not for Beth's repeated no, we might have missed breakfast altogether. By May, Beth was preparing to leave again. We had enough songs for 2 more albums and a tour. As I watched her pack, a deep sadness settled over me. Kelly entered the room with a small, beautifully wrapped package, tears streaming down her face. I know you have to go, Kelly said, her voice breaking. But I'll miss you so much. I wish Daddy had married you first so you could be my mom. When my son came in to announce that the car was ready, he found all 3 of us in a tearful group hug. He joined in, presenting Beth with his own gift. Once summer arrived, I put Kelly on a plane to California. She spent her summer with Beth, while my son and I enjoyed some guy time filled with fishing, hiking, and camping. Labor Day came too quickly, and before I knew it, Kelly was back home, full of stories about her summer with Beth. The bonds we had all formed continued to grow, leaving me grateful for every moment. That summer, we decided to take on a new adventure and bought a couple of retired racehorses. The learning curve was steep, and we spent most of our free time figuring out how to ride properly and nursing the inevitable soreness with liniment. Despite the aches, it turned out to be one of the most enjoyable summers of my life. By fall, I made a big decision. I quit my job. The royalty checks from Beth's music had started rolling in, and they easily surpassed what I was making at work. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with Kelly every few days. She was having the time of her life, and occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of her in the background during Beth's televised appearances. My heart ached with how much I missed them both. The tabloids even picked up on Beth's growing fame, and while their focus was on her, Kelly sometimes appeared in the edges of those glossy photos. Every time I saw their faces or heard their voices, I felt a lump in my throat. Labor Day came far too soon for Kelly, who returned home reluctantly. Back in her routine, she spent most of her time either chatting on the phone with Beth or hanging out with her friends. By then, I was missing Beth more than I could admit. That winter, Beth won multiple Grammy Awards for songs I had written. The kids and I watched the ceremony from the couch, shouting and celebrating as she took the stage. When she closed her speech with, "And a special thank you to my 3 friends back east, you know who you are," we erupted with pride. It was a surreal moment, knowing that a piece of me had reached the world through her voice. I was pulled out of this reflection by a voice I hadn't heard in years. It was Mary's. Once soft and sweet, her voice was now coarse and gravelly, worn down by years of cigarettes and alcohol. I barely recognized it. "Brian," she began, hesitating. "If you're hearing this, I guess we're divorced by now. It's been 20 years since I left you and the kids, but I need—" Her words trailed off as her mind seemed to drift back to that time in her life. Mary, then, was a woman disillusioned and restless. The twins were 6, and with them starting school, she suddenly had long, empty days to fill. Brian was at work, and the kids were away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. What she saw in her reflection was a woman who had lost her purpose. Her days blurred into hours of watching soap operas, while her friends seemed to have moved on with meaningful lives, families, careers, and goals. Mary felt trapped, a spectator in her own existence. Looking back, Mary recognized the crossroads where her life had taken a sharp turn. She had been a party girl in her youth, thriving on attention, with little ambition beyond the next good time. Meeting Brian at a club had seemed serendipitous at the time. He was well-dressed, polite, and attentive, qualities that stood out in the sea of men she usually encountered. Their chemistry was immediate, though fleeting. After a few dances and some awkward moments in the parking lot, she had dismissed him as too inexperienced to hold her interest. Instead, she sought out an old lover to satisfy her fleeting desires. Yet Brian lingered in her thoughts. Over time, their paths crossed again, and something about his sincerity broke through her jaded exterior. They fell in love, married, and started a family. For a while, it seemed like the life she hadn't known she wanted. But as the years passed, domesticity wore on her. The monotony of housework and childcare suffocated her, and she longed for the freedom she once had. One day, during an aimless stroll through a mall, she heard her name being called. It was Sherry, an old friend from her party days. They reconnected over coffee, reminiscing about the wild nights they once shared. Sherry still lived that carefree lifestyle, and Mary envied her independence. Their meetings became frequent, and soon Sherry introduced Mary to a new circle of friends. That's when Mary met Tyrone, a charming and charismatic man who reawakened her rebellious spirit. Their gatherings revolved around smoking marijuana and pushing boundaries. What started as mild flirtations spiraled into a full-blown affair. Mary didn't feel remorse. She felt alive. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened by responsibility and embraced the chaos. Over time, these rendezvous grew darker. Mary and Sherry became willing participants in increasingly debauched gatherings. Lines blurred, and boundaries vanished as they engaged in reckless behaviors, often surrounded by men who saw them as nothing more than entertainment. For Mary, it became an escape, a life where she could forget her obligations and lose herself in the moment. Looking back, Mary could see the cracks forming in her marriage, but at the time, she ignored them. She believed she was chasing freedom, though it came at the cost of everything she once held dear. As she sat before Brian now, the weight of her choices hung heavy in the air, and her words seemed stuck in her throat, unable to bridge the gap of 20 lost years. One day, Mary found herself at Tyrone's apartment with a few of his friends. The atmosphere reeked of desperation and indulgence. After her encounters with a couple of the men, she idly watched one of them preparing a needle. Without asking or warning, he plunged it into her arm. The rush that followed was unlike anything she had ever felt. intense, euphoric, and consuming. Within weeks, Mary began showing up at Tyrone's place every morning after her kids left for school. She made no effort to hide her descent. She arrived wearing only a coat and shoes, discarding the coat as soon as she entered. The encounters began immediately, often before she reached the bedroom. The needle always followed, filling her with a bliss so overpowering that she lost herself, drifting into unconsciousness. Each dose grew stronger, pulling her deeper into an abyss she didn't care to escape. Soon, Mary's obsession became her life's centerpiece. She stopped caring about anything else. One day, the men dressed her, packed some of her belongings into a van, and gave her another shot before driving away. It was the last time she ever saw her home. Her existence spiraled into a cycle of submission and pills. Mary's life was reduced to a grim routine of enduring whatever was demanded of her in exchange for the next dose. The substances became her only solace, her sole purpose. She didn't care about dignity or the cost of her actions. She lived only for the fleeting relief they provided. As time passed, Mary sank further into depravity. She remembered hazy fragments, degrading acts with men, women, and sometimes worse. She recalled performing explicit acts on stage, exposing herself to strangers, and sinking into behaviors that obliterated any semblance of her former self. Over the years, her body deteriorated and her mind became a blur. She wasn't even coherent enough to dance anymore, let alone resist. One day, Tyrone informed her that she was leaving. He had sold her to a new owner. Mary was loaded into a vehicle and transported to a brothel in Mexico, where her life became a waking nightmare. There, she was kept sedated. If a client complained, she was tortured. Time lost all meaning. She existed only in fragments of pain, brief relief from a shot, and the endless parade of customers. At one point, she became pregnant. The captors restrained her and forced a traumatic medical procedure without proper care. The experience left her in unbearable pain, both physical and emotional, with lasting scars. Her pills intake was manipulated as a means of control. Compliance brought minimal relief, while dissatisfaction led to further suffering. This cycle defined her existence, a harrowing balance between fleeting moments of reprieve and relentless torment. Time lost all meaning as her days blurred into one endless nightmare. One day, she was thrown into a van alongside others who had not survived. The air was suffocating, filled with despair and the weight of her circumstances. She knew the vehicle was heading to a remote location, and fear consumed her. Her thoughts spiraled into desperation, but her mind was too clouded to act. Eventually, the van stopped, and the silence was broken by distant sounds of chaos. She braced for the worst, but then the noise ceased. The back doors opened briefly, but the sight inside caused the onlookers to retreat, leaving her alone with the haunting stillness. Mary summoned the strength to kick open the doors and tumble onto the desert floor. Somehow, she managed to reach the front of the van, where she discovered the driver and his companion, both lifeless, their presence already drawing desert scavengers. Inside the vehicle, she found a stash of supplies: medication, water, and food. Realizing the supply was limited, she carefully rationed the medication, gradually reducing her intake to stave off withdrawal while making it last as long as possible. For the first time in years, she wasn't completely consumed by the immediate need for her next fix. But she also knew that the moment the pills ran out, the agony would return. For now, she clung to the fragile peace she'd found, unsure of what her next step would be, or if there even was one. One scorching day in a remote desert village, a poor Mexican farmer stumbled upon Mary, barely alive, huddled in the dirt near an abandoned van. Her sunburned skin and emaciated frame spoke volumes of her suffering. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in an old, tattered blanket and carried her to his battered truck, driving her back to his small village. There, he entrusted her to the care of the local priest. The priest, 2 compassionate nuns, and a doctor worked tirelessly to save her. Mary endured agonizing withdrawal under the watchful eye of the doctor, who stayed with her through the relentless tremors and racking pain. Meanwhile, the priest and nuns prayed fervently for her soul. Over 6 months, Mary was nursed back to health, slowly emerging from the wreckage of her obsession, though not without scars. She bore a deep, disfiguring gash across her face and had lost one eye, a mystery even to her. The first time she saw her reflection in the mirror, her remaining eye filled with tears. Once beautiful, she now looked battered and broken. That night, overcome by despair, she attempted to take her own life. A nun caught her in time, gently bandaging her wrists and staying by her side. From then on, the nuns took shifts watching over her, ensuring she couldn't act on her pain. They removed the mirror from her room, not returning it for almost a year. When they finally brought it back, Mary accepted her new appearance with a quiet resignation. All she requested was a clean eye patch. One day, she looked at a calendar and realized 16 years had passed since the fateful day she met Sherry in the mall. Memories of her old life began to surface, her family, her children, and the life she'd left behind. Determined to return home, Mary faced her next challenge. She had no money, no identification, and no way to start her journey. The small church community came together, raising enough funds to buy her a bus ticket to Mexico City. From there, Mary worked odd jobs, scraping together enough money to continue her trip to a U.S.-Mexico border town. At the border, her lack of identification barred her entry. It took 2 years of persistence and bureaucratic struggle before she managed to obtain a green card listing her nationality as Brazilian. The designation puzzled her, but her sun-darkened skin made the claim plausible. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting into the United States. Once across the border, Mary embarked on a grueling year-long journey back to the Northeast. She took whatever work she could find, hitched rides when possible, and slept wherever she could, under bridges and alleys or wherever she wouldn't be disturbed. Her scarred face and eye patch warded off unwanted attention, as most people assumed she was dangerous or deranged. She finally made her way to Rochester, where she remembered her family's old address. But when she arrived, the new occupant told her the family had moved out over a decade ago to a small farm outside Minden, New York. The woman offered no invitation or further assistance. With the last of her money, Mary rented a dingy room in the village and began piecing together clues about her family's whereabouts. She found work on a cleaning crew, scrubbing offices at night while continuing her search during the day. Finally, late in October, she found an address. Excited and filled with hope, Mary began hitchhiking to their home. She couldn't afford a taxi, but her determination pushed her forward. Her final ride dropped her off at the entrance to a long driveway. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and rain mixed with sleet drenched her thin clothes. Wrapping her arms around herself for warmth, she began the long walk up the driveway. By the time she reached the house, she was soaked and shivering uncontrollably. Dim lights glowed from the back of the large home, guiding her through the darkness. She rang the doorbell and waited, trembling. The door opened, and there stood Brian. For the first time in 2 decades, Mary felt a flicker of light inside her battered soul. She was home, or so she thought. My expression hardened as he took in the sight of her. Memories of lonely nights, crying children, and a broken family came flooding back. Without a word, I shut the door. The sound of it closing echoed in her ears. Despair overwhelmed her, and she slumped against the door, sliding to the ground. Inside, I hesitated. Beth will never forgive me if I don't help her, he muttered to himself. Imagining her stern disapproval, he turned back and opened the door. There lay Mary, crumpled and soaked, struggling to stand. Her whispered apologies were barely audible, but the sight of her frail frame and trembling lips stirred something in him. I reached down, lifting her by the arms until she was upright. She clung to him weakly, mumbling incoherent words. I sighed, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her body was icy to the touch, and I knew she needed help. Carrying her inside, I resolved to take the first step, unsure of what lay ahead but unwilling to let her collapse in the cold. When I realized how dire the situation was, I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency with one hand while trying to keep my composure. The state police arrived first, their flashing lights illuminating the driveway, followed closely by an ambulance. The EMTs wasted no time. They wrapped Mary in a thermal blanket, adding heat packs to help stabilize her shivering. As they worked, they coordinated with the local hospital via radio, receiving permission from a doctor to start her on an IV. I watched, numb, as they took over her care. While the EMTs worked, a state trooper approached me with a clipboard and an air of professionalism. "Do you know her?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice heavy. "She's my ex-wife." "How long have you been divorced?" He followed up. 20 years, I admitted. "I haven't seen her since she disappeared back then. I don't know what happened to her." The questions continued, but my focus kept drifting to Mary as the EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Before they left, I turned to the officer. "I don't have a car here. Can you give me a ride to the hospital? I need to answer their questions too, and you can finish yours there." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke into his shoulder radio. I only caught snippets of the conversation, most of it in code, but I recognized the name of the hospital. Moments later, additional police cars pulled up, parking haphazardly across my lawn. One officer informed me that they'd be securing the house while I was away. Judging by the deep tire tracks, they weren't going to be fixing my lawn anytime soon. The trooper led me to his car, opening the back door. "Rules," he said when I hesitated. "No civilians in the front." The ride to the hospital was fast, and he spent much of it on the radio. Once we arrived, I was let out of the back seat and escorted inside. After Mary was admitted, I signed the necessary paperwork, agreeing to be financially responsible for her care. They allowed me to see her, but the trooper trailed behind, still asking his endless stream of questions. Mary was lying in a small cubicle separated from others by flimsy curtains. Oxygen tubes were in her nose, an IV hung on a pole beside her, and monitors beeped quietly around her. Her face was pale, her body frail, and her eyes closed. My chest tightened as I stood there, wrestling with a swirl of emotions. I wanted to hate her for the years of pain she had caused, but compassion for her suffering kept overriding my anger. For a moment, I wished Beth were there to ground me, to help me sort through the turmoil. But Beth was thousands of miles away in California, and I was alone. A pair of nurses and an orderly interrupted my thoughts. One of them informed me, "We're going to keep her overnight. We have a room upstairs ready for her." The other nurse added with a small smile, "She's going to be okay. Her vitals are good, and the doctor says her heart sounds strong. In a few days, she'll be back on her feet." The word home popped into my head. She doesn't have a home anymore, I thought. Not really. I stepped away to call Beth and explain the situation. She listened patiently, then grilled me with her trademark intensity, tougher than any police interrogation. When she finally calmed down, she said, "Stay with her, once we know more. If she's willing, bring her here. The kids would like to see her, and I'd like to meet her." Mary spent a week in the hospital. I stayed by her side because she wouldn't let go of my hand. Each time she woke up, she would look at me, see I was still there, and start crying. It broke something inside me to see her so fragile. The police and FBI interviewed her extensively about the past 2 decades. I learned more about her horrifying journey than I ever wanted to know. When the interviews were done, I called Beth and recounted everything. By the time I finished, we were both in tears. One day, after returning from my hotel room freshly showered, I noticed Mary's door was closed. A new sign hung on it, "Biohazard, do not enter." A nurse found me and led me to a small conference room where a doctor joined us. His expression was heavy, and I knew bad news was coming. "There's no easy way to say this," he began. "Mary has a severe, untreated STD. It's very advanced and untreatable at this stage. She has about 6 to 7 months left to live." The tears came before I could stop them. I felt gutted. All those years she had endured, clawing her way back to some semblance of life, only to be met with this. It felt cruel, unfair. I couldn't stop thinking, why now? Why this? Later that afternoon, I called Beth. After hearing the news, she said softly, "Bring her home to us. She doesn't deserve to die alone." It took another week to arrange everything. Beth worked her magic, calling in favors I could never have managed. We flew west on a private jet donated by one of her business acquaintances. When we arrived in California, Beth welcomed Mary into our home with open arms. We set her up with a health aide, making her as comfortable as possible. Whatever time she had left, she wouldn't face it alone. The first time Mary met Kelly and her husband Edward was unforgettable. Kelly, 7 months pregnant and glowing, brought Mary to tears. When Kelly tried to hug her, Mary stepped back saying, "I'm not clean. I won't risk hurting you or the baby." Kelly stayed determined. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "I need to know my mother while I can." For the rest of Mary's time with us, Kelly visited almost daily, missing only 4 days to give birth to her daughter, Mary Beth. When Beth told Mary about the baby, they cried together. Kelly brought the baby to meet both grandmothers, but Mary refused to hold her, fearing the risk of infection. My son, however, never visited. He couldn't forgive Mary for leaving, and when I explained his feelings to her, she cried, but never brought him up again. Mary grew weaker over the next 6 months. One morning, she passed peacefully in her sleep. We cremated her and placed her ashes in an urn under a small garden pavilion. We often sit by her resting place, updating her on family life. Despite everything, I hope she finally found the peace she sought.